Hi, my name is John Brooks, and I chose behavioral learning for my project and presentation. Um, to get started, we'll go through an overview of what we're going to cover on this. First, that definition of learning. Learning is defined as a change in an individual caused by experience. In the book, there's a definition of a long-lasting change in the learner's knowledge as a result of the learner's experience, their personal experience and what they've learned individually, and how they've adjusted to that. We'll go through classical conditioning, which is by Pavlov, and operant conditioning by Skinner, and then we'll look at a few principles of behavioral learning. First, looking at classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. And he was studying the digestive process in dogs, and he noticed a trend that when he would place meat near the dog, that they were salivating, and that was a natural reaction they had. And looking at this, they saw meat as an unconditioned stimulus because they had never learned to salivate because of meat, or the meat had never been taught to them as something to make them react this way. So it's an unconditioned stimulus, meaning it's something that they haven't learned to react to, but it's something that makes them react. And then salivation is the unconditioned response. So they salivate when the meat is placed next to them. So it's not trained to do so, they just naturally do it. And then to take this further, they introduced bells, and bells were a neutral stimulus. They didn't mean anything to the dogs. They could hear the bells, but they didn't have any reaction to them. So when they combined the bells with the meat, he would present the meat and ring a bell, or ring a bell and present the meat, and that was a unconditioned response. So they'd still salivate because of the meat being there. But as they went on, they used the bells by themselves after introducing the bells and the meat together, and the dogs would relate the bells to what the meat brought them. So the bells would actually make them salivate. And the results were a conditioned response. So they were conditioned to treat the bells as a meaning they were getting meat, and they would salivate because of the bells. Moving on to operant conditioning. This was B.F. Skinner, and he believed that classical reflexive, or Pavlov's theory behavior, accounts only for some of a person's behavior. His work focused on people's behavior and the consequences related to their behavior, so what the result was of their actions. The use of pleasant or unpleasant consequences to change behavior is referred to as operant conditioning. Skinner used controlled environments to measure and evaluate with no outside influences each individual case. So he had individual boxes that isolated rats and other animals to have a controlled environment where he could influence anything that was going on with that particular subject. In one case, the rats were trained that if they would press a bar, they would receive food. And only by this action would they ever receive food. And they could use some interval with that, whether it's every 3 pushes or every 5 pushes or every other push. But they'd get to where they were pushing the bar to receive the food because they wanted the food. So they were getting a desired behavior to receive the pleasant consequences. So they were pushing the bar like Skinner wanted them to and receiving their reward, so everybody wins. But as you said, looking at operant conditioning and continued, some teachers use candy for good behavior. Working quietly or hard may result in candy or some kind of prize, while not working well may result in no reward or negative consequences, such as losing recess. Skinner and Pavlov principles are often related, and like I said, Skinner he believed in Pavlov's theory, but only believed that was part of why humans act the way they act and part of what our learning is. Classical and operant conditioning, really this example uses both, but at the school we work at now, when it's time to come in from recess, or we're in the hallway or anything like that, we have a 5 to 0 count where we start with one hand up and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And when we started school, the students would talk over the counting and not realize anything was coming of it, and But after a while, we started punishing students for talking after the count got to 0 or 5. And students who were talking at 0 would spend minutes of recess walking laps either that day or the next day if that was after recess. After the students received punishment or saw friends receive punishment, they began to realize that the counting meant it was time to be quiet. And anyone that was talking after that, they were able to automatically relate that to, I better be quiet or I lose recess. So initially the counting was an unconditioned and neutral stimulus. It didn't mean anything to them, and talking was their response. That's what they were doing naturally and already doing it. Counting now is conditioned stimulus. When we start counting, it's our stimulus for them to realize that it's time to be quiet, and the absence of talking is the conditioned response. So now we see them quiet down and stop talking when it's time for this. When the count gets to 0. Moving on to some of the principles related to these both learning theories. Look at consequences. These are building blocks of behaviors and behavioral learning. So consequences are the most important in understanding of consequences that coincide with the behavior is important in understanding. Pleasurable consequences increase the frequency, and unpleasant consequences decrease the frequency. A reinforcer is any consequence that strengthens a behavior. No reward can automatically be assumed as a reinforcer because some reinforcers, like candy, some kid might not want candy, which is an example used in the book. If they just ate a big meal, they don't want candy, it wouldn't be something that's going to positively reinforce them because they're not in the mood for it, don't want it. So you can't automatically assume that's going to be an automatic reinforcer for them. Primary reinforcers satisfy basic human needs. Secondary reinforcers acquire value by being associated with primary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers would be food, water, air. Secondary reinforcers, which would be candy or it could be food in the same way, but you're learning it based on what your primary needs are. So if you're missing time to talk at lunch, your primary need was to eat, but you're losing the free time that comes along with eating lunch. Positive reinforcers are most often used in schools, and those are grades and praise or stars or golden stars, whatever it might be that you get value, and you can show value. Your grade you can take home and show your parents and show your friends. Negative reinforcements are not punishment, but an escape from unpleasant situations. So a student might do their homework in order to not have to do the dishes or something like that. And as it relates to that, if they're working well at home, they don't have to do something else at home. They're not being punished for anything, but they're doing something in place of something. Principles continue. Punishers are consequences that weaken behavior. Behavior or action ceases because of the consequence. If it does not reduce the behavior, then it cannot automatically be assumed a punisher. Presentation punishment is the use of unpleasant consequences. All can see these and observe them, like scolding a student in front of the class. Removal punishment is withdrawal of pleasant consequences. So it would be loss of privilege, like we mentioned before, loss of recess, which we used in our student example, loss of free time, whatever it might be. Removal punishment is taking away pleasant consequences from the student. As we look back, for all behavioral theories to be effective, or behavioral strategies to be effective, the consequences need to be as immediate as possible in order to reinforce and take effect. As soon as they associate a behavior with a certain consequence, they can edit or alter their behavior. The timing of punishment and consequences is key in molding and taking advantage of the learning principle.